Hideyoshi wasn't the only one in the late 16th century thinking about conquering China. Down in the Philippines, at the colony of Manila, the Spanish had the same idea. Like Hideyoshi, they viewed Ming China as weak and in decline and ripe for conquest, ready for picking. They were serious about it too. They drew up detailed plans. They were ready to sail as soon as they got approval from King Philip II back home in Madrid. In this episode, the Spanish plan to conquer China. As always, before we get going, please subscribe to this channel. Thank you. The idea of conquering China went back a very long way with the Spanish, back to the early years of their conquest of the New World. In 1526, after conquering the Aztec Empire and renaming it New Spain, Hernán Cortés sent a letter home to the Spanish king in Madrid suggesting that an expedition be sent across the Pacific Ocean to extend Spain's growing empire into Asia. It would take the Spanish 3 more decades to actually cross the Pacific and establish a toehold in Asia. This pioneering expedition, led by Miguel López de Legazpi, set out from Mexico in 1564 and landed in the Philippines, naming it after Spain's King Philip II. It was a struggle for the colonists just to survive there for the first several years. They were starving and were repeatedly attacked by Chinese pirates and the rival Portuguese. But that didn't stop them from wanting to conquer even more. Starting in 1569, they began talking about making a move against China. It was an Augustinian friar named Martin Dorada who first suggested the idea in a letter to the Viceroy of New Spain. China, he said, was a land that is very large and rich and of high civilization, with cities, forts, and walls much greater than those of Europe. To conquer it, though, wouldn't be as daunting as it seemed, because the people of China are not at all warlike. They rely entirely on numbers and on the fortification of their walls. It would decapitate them if any of their forts were taken. Consequently, I believe, God helping, that they can be subdued and with few forces. Now, it might seem incongruous that an Augustinian friar, a Christian monk, was calling for the conquest of China. But really it wasn't. Martin Dorada wouldn't have seen the conquest of China as simply a matter of taking something from the Chinese, of seizing their country. The Spanish would be giving them something in return. Christianity, the gift of salvation. There was no doubt many conquistadors who didn't really care about this, who just talked about saving souls as a justification for enriching themselves. But many others, men like Martin Dorada, were serious about it. They really meant it. 4 years after Dorada sent off his letter, a ship's captain named Diego de Artieda took up the cause with a direct appeal to King Philip II. He wrote that the Philippine colony just wasn't panning out, that it should be abandoned, and that the Spanish should move on to China, which had so much more potential. Like Dorada, Artieda claimed that China was weak and would be easy to conquer. All he needed to get the ball rolling was 2 moderate-sized ships and only 80 well-armed men. With that, they could establish a colony on the Chinese mainland and then go on to conquer the whole country. Martin Dorada and Captain Artieda never got the go-ahead from Spain for the conquest of China. In Manila, meanwhile, enthusiasm for the idea continued to build. In 1576, the governor of the Philippines, Francisco de Sandy, sent a letter to King Philip II outlining a serious plan. He would raise a force of 4,000 to 6,000 Spaniards, he wrote, reinforced by Japanese and Chinese pirates, who would sign on for the prospect of loot. They would build a fleet of galleys on the northern tip of Luzon, and from there sail to China's south coast. They would then seize one Chinese province. This would be, quote, very easy, because the Chinese were largely unarmed. According to Desande, a corsair with 200 men could rob a large town of 30,000 inhabitants. They are very poor marksmen, and their arquebuses are worthless. Desande concluded, somewhat optimistically, that all the other provinces of China would then fall to the Spanish, because the Chinese were a downtrodden people and would rise up against the Ming. Once again, King Philip refused to sanction the plan. He already had a huge empire, more than enough to worry about. The conquest of China also probably would end up costing his treasury a good deal, even though Desande assured him that it wouldn't, that the conquest of China could be done on the cheap. And then there was the concern about unleashing conquistadors on the far side of the world. Ambitious men like Desande could get Spain into all kinds of trouble in China, and it would take a year for the news to reach New Spain. And then it would take another year for orders to be sent back, by which time the situation in China could have totally changed. So King Philip never gave the go-ahead. Enthusiasm for an expedition to China continued to build in the Philippines throughout the next decade. The two governors that succeeded Desande both tried to get something going. These efforts culminated in 1586, during the governorship of Santiago de Vera, with the most detailed plan yet, outlined in a memorandum to King Philip II and signed by 50 of Manila's leading citizens. The memorandum estimated that an expeditionary force of 10,000 to 12,000 Spaniards would be needed, plus Filipinos and Japanese mercenaries, between 20 and 25,000 men altogether. The Portuguese would be invited to join in to make the invasion even more overwhelming. The staging area would be the mouth of the Cagayan River on the north coast of Luzon. A fleet of galleys would be constructed here under the guidance of master shipwrights that would be sent out from Spain. When the expeditionary force was ready, it would sail across the South China Sea and land on the coast of Fujian province. Portuguese forces at the colony at Macau would simultaneously push into Guangdong province. The two armies would then independently slash their way to Beijing, oust the emperor and his court and top officials, and establish themselves in ultimate authority there. The rest of the Ming government, the lower-ranking officials, the regional bureaucrats, they would be left in place under Spanish control to maintain order amongst China's huge population. An interesting detail in this final plan, this ultimate plan, was that the Spanish weren't going to manufacture the gunpowder, the bullets, and the cannonballs they'd need for the conquest of China. It would be much cheaper, Governor de Vera noted, for them to purchase these munitions from the Chinese. It took a year and a half for Governor de Vera's memorandum to reach King Philip II in Spain. It was now 1588, and the Spanish Armada sent against England had just been destroyed. This killed off any chance of Philip ever giving his approval for the conquest of China. The plan was shelved and eventually forgotten. The Spanish in the Philippines, however, they didn't give up the idea of conquest on the Asian mainland altogether. A new idea presented itself, the conquest of Cambodia. A pair of adventurers arrived in Manila with a beguiling tale about how Cambodia was weak, how it was being threatened by neighboring Thailand, and how the Cambodian king was desperate for help. An expeditionary force was thrown together with the idea of saving the Cambodian king and taking over his country. It set sail in 1596. 120 Spaniards, plus Filipinos and Japanese mercenaries, 300 or 400 men altogether. They sailed across the South China Sea, up the Mekong River, and headed into disaster. The Spanish attempt to conquer Cambodia totally failed.